Welcome to the Owens Recovery Science Podcast, where we dive deep into all things blood flow restriction training. I'm your show host, Johnny Owens, and whether you're a clinician, researcher, or athlete, you've come to the right place. Each episode, we break down the latest research, interview leading experts, and translate complex science into practical applications. We're here to bridge the gap between laboratory findings and real-world implementation. Welcome back to another Owens Recovery Science podcast. I've got a special crew. The old crew is back. It's been so long they didn't know how to get their mics and their headphones to work, but finally, these newbies have figured it out. So we have Zach and Ben back on the podcast with us, and Kyle.
Woo.
And I kind of like this podcast, Kyle. Kyle's like, hey, I've got a podcast I want to do. You guys don't prepare. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
No agenda. Oh, like this
Let's
is a freaking
chop it up.
setup. This is a setup. Kyle's
I love
got
it.
a bee in his bonnet. He's going to try and trick us on something.
It's a trap.
It
That's
is
the-
a trap. Let's
that's
do it on
the-
Monday after Father's Day because, Johnny never passes up a party. So I'm already hungover from last night and my brain's not working. Dude, it's sad. Like any celebration, like my birthday, Father's Day, whatever, all my presents look the same. They're all like a little bag about the shape of a bottle. Like, can you guys get a little more creative? There might be a UT shirt, throw it in every now and then. But all right,
That's awesome.
so Kyle, you freaking cook, man. Let's see what you got. I'm ready to shoot some bullets.
Well, yeah. So something that I've been experiencing recently is a lot of people asking me about using eccentric exercise with BFR. And in some cases, even just sort of the assumption from people that it would actually be better to do it in that manner. Like the eccentric portion of the contraction would provide a better stimulus for hypertrophy and things like that. So I just figured that might be a good kind of topic for us to talk about. There's a few different studies that have looked at combining BFR with eccentric exercise. But it really, for me, kind of started from a place of, well, what do we even know about eccentric exercise? Like how much of the information that we hear is accurate? How much of it is lacking context, that sort of thing. So, I mean, I'm just kind of curious from you guys, have y'all had people asking you that question about eccentric exercise, and how do you usually answer it?
Dude, I submitted a whole freaking grant to the NFL with it. With every Pac-12 team and every SEC team except for one on board. So maybe I'm one of those dumbasses that's maybe why we didn't get the grant. But it was a thought. We made it to the finals. We were the last two. Did you know, Kyle, that Dr. Feely was on the panel? Did I tell you that?
No, I did not know that.
Yeah.
He was on that panel.
It was during, COVID, so we had
Yeah.
to do a Zoom panel, and he was one of the ones. I should have got on his ass on the podcast. We're rejecting
That's
us.
so funny.
Yeah, they picked something new and novel instead to study, eccentric exercise for hamstring injuries. Like, wow, no one's ever looked at that before. But
Yeah.
anyways,
yeah.
so,
Yeah.
I mean, I've got thoughts. Look, like we know the Yasuda, Jeremy's like, long time ago, concentric versus eccentric, concentric did better. But I don't get a ton of people asking. The Olympic team, when I was out there, for their runners, we're talking about that the runners really hate doing Nordics because it just makes their hamstrings feel tight for a long time. And, and we can go into this, there is a potential for less muscle damage, maybe.
Yeah.
If you do BFR, low load, eccentric. So that was a thought. But I get more about BFR and isometrics. But what about you, Zach or Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it comes up maybe every now and then, not super frequent. But I think the the question or the answer to the question I'd always give is basically, what are you looking to change, or what are you looking to target? And then that would be my kind of, is there benefit to it or whatnot? And then what is the context of the individual you're working with? And then that would also help to drive the answer.
Yeah. I don't feel like I get the question all that often. It comes up, like Zach was saying, every now and then. And I feel like it typically comes up around the idea of, rehabbing tendon. People will be like, oh, I know we're supposed to be doing eccentrics. So should I be doing eccentrics with my BFR? Is that better? And I tend to say, I think it really depends on how you're performing the exercise and how much weight you're able to actually load for the exercise as to, is this something that we really need to have that much more focus on eccentric versus just performing an isotonic exercise and trying to get to fatigue. So, yeah, limited conversations about it come up for me.
So teach us up on eccentrics, Kyle.
Yeah. So that was kind of my next question is, well, what do you guys, what do you think about them, or what do you believe about them? Because I suspect we all probably have learned a lot of the same shit in school or heard it from people. But when you think eccentric exercise, and you were asked to describe it to somebody, how would you describe it?
So I went to school in the 90s, bro, and we didn't learn physiology. We just learned modalities. Diathermy, ultrasound, this new thing called e-stim. So, but yeah, eccentrics, more tension. There's muscle damage. You can handle more load than concentric. But the thing that was always with a BFR perspective is concentric, there's more metabolite accumulation. So you're probably getting a little more juice from the BFR side.
Mm-hmm. When you're combining with concentric, you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The metabolite accumulation, it's more mechanical tension on an eccentric, lengthening, sarcomere damage versus concentric. We're getting a lot more of the metabolite accumulation, which is probably why Yasuda saw they won. Even though maybe in that study where concentrics beat eccentrics, they were underdosing the eccentrics.
What did you learn?
Else go.
Yeah,
what do you remember?
The main concepts that I remember are, just the using it as an overload strategy, being able to load heavier than you can typically control or manage concentrically. Definitely, a lot of conversation around more muscle damage in that, eccentric form of exercise than just a traditional concentric or isotonic. I know that I don't like eccentrics from personal experience. That was always a common theme for me. It was a lot of discomfort and typically some more soreness, likely because I hated to train it and didn't do it that often. So when I did it, it broke me off for a while. But yeah, a lot of the same things that Johnny mentioned.
Okay. Z?
Yeah.
He's going to be like, well, the phosphorylation of S6K. And then
the cross bridging is,
yeah,
that's not what we're going for right now so much. So it's just like general beliefs, general thoughts that are out
I
there
think my opinion on eccentrics has changed recently or has evolved. I would say in school and even early on, since I was a PT, people had this belief that eccentrics were superior, whether that be in terms of muscle or predominantly tendon. But I think a lot of things have changed with that. I think it was Johnny mentioned Nordics and whatnot. And I think one of the things that we see with Nordics, with eccentrics, is that's really not the end all be all. And there's a lot of emerging evidence now that says that Nordics may not be as beneficial as we originally thought they were, largely as it relates to the specific muscle involved and the action on the joint, the knee versus the hip. But yeah, I think things have changed with eccentrics and what I believe to be effective.
Okay. let me see if these ring true with you. Just like I wrote down, I've heard people say eccentrics prioritize like the recruitment of type 2 fibers. Have y'all heard that out there?
Not till I read your agenda.
Not till you read my.
I mean,
okay.
So I hadn't heard that from a loading from. Yeah, if you look at it like you're going to basically be able to load the muscle more, so you would load an eccentric more. I would say that, yeah, you could believe that.
I can make some logical sense.
So
of it,
yeah. Let me constrain that a little bit. Then, though, the context of that statement, eccentrics recruit more type 2, is irrespective of load. So it is saying, regardless of the load, you're going to prioritize the recruitment of type 2 fibers. That's the context of that statement that's out there. If y'all heard that, or do you go bullshit?
I think bullshit.
Okay.
I would.
Because then you would just get yoked.
Right.
I mean,
like if I just straighten my elbow, I don't think I'm recruiting a ton of type 2 fibers. But yeah, right. Yeah. Drinking.
Right. I've heard eccentric exercise.
That's a myth, right? We mythed that.
I'm not saying the yay or nay. No, I'm just saying, all I'm saying is these are the things that I have heard, that I've heard out there in the ethos and talking to people and just like picking up stuff and looking at things. Like, this is what I read on Instagram when somebody provides some sort of an explanation. And I'm like, well, eccentrics recruit more type 2 sure seems to lack a lot of context for me when I just think about it critically. But also, like, where the hell does that come from is sort of where my head goes too. Like, why would people have that belief and that belief be repeated from multiple sources that are not, related to one another in any way? So that's one that I have heard a number of times. I've also heard eccentrics cause more damage than concentric exercise, which you guys, obviously context within load, but I feel like you would echo that to a degree based on what you have said. Eccentrics are stronger, right? You're stronger eccentrically, right? Okay.
20 to 50% or something like that.
Somewhere in that neighborhood. Yep. Those are the main ones that I have heard, but I think it's, if there's anybody listening that doesn't know what an eccentric versus a concentric is,
please stop listening.
I know. Yeah. Maybe it's not the right podcast, but it helps us sort of explain why there's potentially some thought behind you get a larger amount of exercise-induced muscle damage. You have this sliding filament theory with regard to how muscle contracts. The myosin head cross bridges to the actin and pulls on it, and then that kind of continues to happen. That's how and basically when you do a concentric exercise, the muscle is shortening, whereas when you perform an eccentric contraction, the muscle is lengthening. So those cross bridges are kind of breaking free. But the thought is that as that muscle is lengthening, those cross bridges are tearing off and damaging the muscle. And so that's where that muscle damage comes from. When I was kind of thinking about this, one of the hard things that I had a really hard time reconciling, for starters, was, well, how in the world could eccentric exercise cause more muscle damage, but I'm also 20 to 40% stronger with an eccentric exercise, right? Because how does that jive with the traditional isotonic exercise? That created a problem for me logically. I'm like, that doesn't make sense. If I can lift this weight, why in the world would that same weight that I can lift concentrically cause damage eccentrically? So do you guys, have you thought about it in that context, or do you understand why that happens maybe?
Well, the lengthening effect can play into it, but I've always thought it was the load. So you're going to be doing more load eccentrically, and you're going to get more muscle damage because the load would be higher than what you're able to.
The load, you just picked up the load. The load's the same as you picked up. It's an isotonic exercise.
But
Is that true, though?
I think
the
this is
same load.
I think what Johnny's saying is I think we're talking about maybe two different things, Kyle.
My context that I'm bringing up is the context of prescribing exercise, as we traditionally do, based off of a 1 repetition maximum, right? And the eccentric portion of that exercise is what's causing the damage.
Well, I think this is where the context is maybe lacking, because I know for me, when I thought
there's something missing. There has to be, right?
When I thought of eccentrics causing more muscle damage, I was thinking of it in the context of how I was initially exposed to it, which is overloading an exercise to perform the eccentric portion of the movement with help for the concentric portion of the movement, because I couldn't do the concentric myself, right? Versus load matched, or just, doing an isotonic exercise that you can normally perform for a set number of reps, and saying that the eccentric portion of that movement is somehow causing more damage than the concentric.
So there, that's perfect. So yes, all of that, but the statement eccentrics cause more damage than concentric would be a statement that is made regardless of load. And I would argue that is believed, generally speaking. And what's interesting is has some physiologic foundation. So what I found was that, like Johnny said earlier, metabolically, we see the cost of a concentric exercise being greater. Like there's more work having to be done by the muscle. And we see, things like EMG being greater with the concentric portion versus the eccentric portion. And so what looks like happens is once you begin to perform that eccentric exercise, and this is where that knowledge of like you heavily recruit type 2, it looks like you use kind of a skeleton crew of muscle fiber to perform the eccentric action. So the amount of muscle you use to pick up the load then gets spread across less muscle fiber as you begin to lower it. And so that's where you might be performing a isotonic exercise, let's say in accordance with ACSM guidelines, like we had for a long time, and we knew those loads caused increases in muscle size and muscle strength. And there's potential now for that load that you have been prescribed based off of an isotonic to actually cause more damage during the eccentric portion. So that's where that notion actually comes from. It's been shown to be accurate. So it's like this thing called the skeleton crew theory. And I think what's interesting is it kind of makes sense based on, if we think about how we recruit muscle to perform an activity following Henneman's size principle, we just recruit just enough, right? And it's type 1 first, and so on. But then we also know that type 2 fibers have a greater ability to produce force. And so now that once that load has been lifted, if all we have to do is set it down, it kind of makes sense from just like an evolutionary perspective, metabolic cost perspective, that it would behave in that manner, that we might use less muscle to lower it down because we don't need to pick it up. Is that a concept that you guys had heard before?
Well, yeah, and it's not just muscle. I mean, it's the ECM and the static structures.
Well, but
too,
we're just
that
talking
are
about
lengthening.
the type of muscle contraction, though. Yeah, obviously there's
So
plenty
you're saying
of context
if I do,
out.
I'm going to say for me, I was going to say 30 pounds, but 110-pound leg extensions.
Single leg, yeah.
Single leg.
Mm-hmm.
Concentrically, and then I work match it eccentrically. The muscle damage will be more just on the primarily on the eccentric side, because I really always thought it was more load based.
Wait, hold on.
If it's the same load concentrically or eccentrically, there's studies that'll show you're going to have more muscle damage.
Yes.
With the eccentrics.
Correct.
Up to but it has to be a threshold. I mean, a low load isn't going to do it.
And that's where that context piece comes in. Because at some point, that makes zero sense, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense at all that you could pick up a 30% load in the eccentric portion. To Zach's point earlier on, like we were just talking about extending his elbow or something like that. I'm obviously not causing a lot of muscle damage with that. But so at some point, the mechanical sort of structure of muscle, it has a threshold where that does not ring true. And it looks like that's probably around like that 50 to 65% load, which I think, again, kind of goes back to our sort of belief of how muscle used to adapt. We used to think you had to break it down, right, and then repair it and build it back up. And, follows kind of along with our ACSM guidelines, if you will.
Right. Well, I'm glad ChatGPT taught you well, Kyle.
Yeah. ChatGPT plus all the different papers that I have in my paper pile and just asking it questions over and over and over, because I'm just like, I don't understand how this really works. I don't think. So then if we're talking muscle damage, and exercise physiology, we obviously start thinking about DOMS, just the delayed restoration of strength, those sorts of things. But we also have this thing called the repeated bouts effect, right? That sort of makes us more resilient to damage, if you will, or soreness at least, after even just like a second exposure to exercise. So I guess my question then to you guys would be, how do you feel, like, what's your understanding of how like the repeated bouts effect sort of fits into, this role with eccentric exercise? Like, what have you learned, or, what do you know? And we'll talk about maybe what we think happens, at least.
Well, anyone? Zach?
Let Zach take it this time.
Well, you look like he was about
with
to talk.
Nordics, it's been shown that there's a repeated bout effect where initially there's a significant increase in whether it be muscle damage, however you measure that, assess that. It could, you could use DOMS with that. And then as that, your protocol, your program that you're doing with Nordics, as that increases, there's less and less muscle soreness, muscle damage as the deal goes on. And I always tell people this is really kind of where it ties in with your ACSM guidelines, where they're not just a load dependent guideline, there's a duration dependent guideline. And this is where we moved away from the idea that muscle damage is necessary to provoke a hypertrophy response, because you're not building muscle if you're constantly breaking muscle down, and then that protein synthetic response is directed towards repairing damaged muscle versus growing healthy muscle. So
yeah, and it's with each exposure, that's why the first was a Stu Phillips stuff where it was like the muscle damage is just the cost, but eventually the anabolic side starts to take over, and then you start to get hypertrophy, not just muscle fiber, but you're getting collagen synthesis, which is working on the ECM and making those structures more resilient and strong over time. And in my mind, that's always what we got from the repeated bout effect.
Basically, I think, Kyle, you said it becomes more resilient. So you're able to tolerate.
Yeah. Because just literally one exposure can create a repeated bouts effects that lasts something like 6 months.
I browsed over that exact paper that I'm pretty sure, kind of kicked off this question, Kyle. They're talking about potentially you lose it around 9 months after the exposure.
It's wild. It lasts for a very long time.
How do they measure that?
Great question.
Call them bullshit.
Yeah, that's good luck controlling that study.
I think that would probably vary, what are you looking at individuals in that study?
I think they were primarily looking at indirect markers of damage after exposure to eccentrics. Yeah,
that's the most common. But ultimately, the point is that just exposing one time really creates a very robust protective effect to a secondary exposure. So the question then becomes, well,
based on one paper? I mean,
what is actually changing?
Over and over?
No, I mean, this is generally kind of accepted physiology that's out there. Stephen Patterson spouted that very fact to me at CSM. What was it, 6-7 years ago? He was like, yeah, it's something crazy, like 6 months of protection you get from.
So what I'm hearing here, Kyle, is that my current exposure that I'm giving myself to eccentrics of, once or twice a year is plenty, and I don't ever need to do more eccentrics than what I'm currently doing.
I did it. Maybe. I don't know. I don't think so. Because we certainly know different things about, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. You're just trying to not
that
get sore
Brazilian
from doing
striker that pulled his hammy, man. Like, if you would have done your one bout.
Your one bout.
Okay, then what's the mechanism of that?
Well, so I lost my train of thought. Dang it, I hate it.
No, you just didn't know. You weren't prepared for that.
You got
come back.
No,
Mr. Reading off.
I've
been working on this for months.
We were talking about the repeated bout effect lasting 6-9 months.
Yeah.
And I was like, why?
So this is where I was headed with that. Like mechanistically, the question then kind of becomes sort of like, what happened? What's going on there? Like, why would that be? And so there were two general theories for a very long time. And I would say that they're still kind of out there. One is that you add longitudinally sarcomere to the sarcomere, the disruption of the Z disc happens, and then you kind of add longitudinally there. And so the addition of sarcomerogenesis is what it's called, provides protection. The second thought is that you get better at recruiting muscle. So there's some sort of neurophysiologic change that you recruit muscle in a different fashion. So that skeleton crew idea that I mentioned initially, where you're really just kind of going type 2, now that shifts a little bit and you recruit a little bit more type 1 and you're just a little bit better at doing that eccentric. And so now the sheer effect of like pulling the myosin chain head off of and ripping the cross bridges apart and damaging the muscle doesn't happen because you are spreading that out. The problem with that is you don't see increases in EMG through like a second, third exposure, whatever, when you're performing the eccentric portion. And the idea that you would actually add like contractile elements after a single exposure, like when you think about that critically, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And really, honestly, the recruitment of muscle, ordering that differently just through one exposure doesn't really seem to follow, I feel like, what we see in physiology. It's like you've got to like repeatedly do things to convince the body to add muscle, to require more nutrients, et cetera, to function. And so those things don't really don't seem to add up. What'd you say?
I said we're back to it's bullshit.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, I think it's just important to
show me a mechanism or I don't believe it.
At least ask the question, like, what the hell's going on here, So that's where I think this ECM seems to kind of make the most sense and kind of come into play. That likely, over time you lose some of the lateral force transmission components of the extracellular matrix. And, now when you create that damage, that's the thing that you can kind of, not only do you repair the damage to the muscle fiber, but you can sort of repair that extracellular matrix in a lot quicker fashion. And what's wild is something like 80% of the load that you lift concentrically is spread laterally into the extracellular matrix. So I think that also, like, when you think about it critically, that also sort of makes sense in terms of like how you're able to use less muscle and how you're able to be so much stronger eccentrically is because that muscle is already contracted, that force is already spread laterally, and now you start to load into an eccentric fashion, and you've already kind of done all of that work that typically you would do with a concentric exercise.
The ECM's amazing. Like,
amazing.
We worked with that a lot during the wars, and you can take the ECM and implant it into different tissues, and it will grow those tissues. And this Marine who took a freaking RPG like explosion and took out his like almost his whole quad, he couldn't generate any torque at all, and we were able to put the ECM into his muscle that was left, and it just created a giant collagen scar matrix. And the dude was able to generate like, almost 50% torque compared to his other limb after that collagen structure came back. So just some muscle, but a ton of ECM and scar let that guy be able to walk. Which is crazy. So when you're working out, you're not just working out muscle fiber, you're working out ECM as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all the movement. And I think that
now I believe that theory
starts to make a little bit more sense in terms of like what we've learned and what people used to believe in sort of the context now of where our knowledge is. Things start to make a bit more sense. But I think we haven't really come out right and said it and talked about it specifically, but you cannot really just talk about eccentric exercise. You have to talk about eccentric exercise in the context of the load that's being lifted. We lost Zach a bit there.
Just let him log in.
So you, like Ben, when you talk eccentrics, you can clearly tell by the way you're talking about it that you are performing eccentric exercise with a load that you are unable to lift concentrically. So it's a super physiologic load. It is a load that we would have to base off of an eccentric maximum, which is sort of where, Johnny was kind of going with the NFL thing earlier. Like those loads were based off a super maximal physiologic load that they lifted in that study out of USC. They didn't lift a 30% of one repetition maximum load. They lifted a 30% load of the maximum amount of force they were able to produce eccentrically as measured with a Nordic exercise. Makes that context of that study, understanding that, really important. Because if you just look 30% one rep max load, which I think is how it's written, like when they're just kind of abbreviating in there, you think concentric, but it's actually not. It was probably more like a 60% load or something like that they were actually doing.
Todd got badass results too, man.
Well, and they got great results. Yeah, they did.
And he was on my he was my co-author on this grant.
Yeah.
The thing that I'd like to go back to that paper for, and it might be there, I'm not sure, is what is the perceptual side of that, because the idea of the volume of reps that they did at that intensity with that, that's a lot of eccentric volume that they did, and at an 80% pressure, which that alone for hamstring isolated stuff is also pretty rough. I mean, I could see it being significantly effective, and especially compared to, like Johnny brought up the Yasuda paper earlier, 30% of a concentric max when done with an eccentric biased, movement comparing to concentric, it's, didn't really do anything. It wasn't enough. And so,
yeah, well, and there's the pseudo, what is it? It's a mouse, I think.
The mouse study. Yep.
Yeah. So a high eccentric load without BFR, there's a lot of muscle damage. And when they put the cuff on, almost no muscle damage. So it might suck when you're doing it, but what really sucks about eccentrics is day 2, 3, 4. And that's what Todd was saying is like these guys were like, they actually were preferring the BFR because
they weren't as sore. That pseudo paper, or for listeners, the pseudo paper is a rat study or a mouse study? I think it's a rat study, where they induce a maximal contraction via neuromuscular stem. And then they had this dynamometer that just like broke these little rats off into like knee flexion or whatever it was. And so what's wild about the type of muscle damage that's caused there is it's like, instead of where like normally in humans, if you biopsy, it's like little dents and chunks kind of taken out of the muscle. As I understand it, in reading that paper, like the muscle damage is like the length of the fiber. So it's like crazy worse than like the normal muscle damage.
Those little rats were like, damn, man, I don't know what they did to me while I was asleep, but I can hardly walk right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so we need to get to then, what are your thoughts? Well, I'm not trying to hijack your podcast, Kyle, but then what are your thoughts on, should you do BFR with Eccentrics? Because our whole point, obviously, after Todd's work, and, you know, we had all this other stuff in there, the pseudo paper, and, you know, I forgot, maybe it was the one where they did low load to failure and low load with BFR, Eccentrics. And it was, again, similar results, but a third of the work. And so for an injured population, this all seemed really good.
Yeah, I think, you know, that I think the way you guys did Eccentrics is just different than traditional BFR, you know, and you could even maybe look at it as like a progression potentially. You know, maybe you start with a traditional isotonic where you're using a 30% concentric load with BFR, and then you maybe progress to this sort of supra physiologic load, or a load just more based off of an eccentric maximum than a concentric maximum.
Well, what I thought we did, it was slick, because it was in a team setting and they were all going to be getting strength testing. We got pre-injury baseline eccentric 1RM. And even though they might change during the season, we had a ballpark of each player when they got, because we definitely couldn't test it after a hamstring injury, but we knew what it was, so we had a target to go after. Yeah, not everyone can do that, but if you're in a team setting, that's one way. If you're like, well, for my guys that are going to pull a hammy, I could do this BFR in the early phase and get basically what Todd showed. Everything was equal to lifting heavy eccentrically and less muscle damage.
Yeah.
And maybe some analgesia.
Yeah. This is one of those places where I tend to think you absolutely can do BFR with an eccentric focus, as long as, like we talked about, the context and the parameters are appropriate. You know, I tend to think what most people are doing with BFR is probably light enough that maybe the eccentric focus is not going to do what we intend it to. And that's where, you know, I tend to, you know, when the conversation comes up, that's one of the main points that I make is like, you know, are you really going to be doing enough that the eccentric focus is going to make a difference? Or should we just be doing our isotonic exercise to fatigue? And then as you can tolerate more load, let's go push some loading. And then again, you know, from an eccentric standpoint, are we talking about, you know, heavier load? Are we talking about something with some speed? What is the goal and what's available to dictate if we should be doing it with BFR?
Yeah. Well, I think the key point out of all this was, if you're doing eccentric with BFR, you're not in a 20-30% 1RM to probably move that needle.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's
the problem. There's not a
place I'm going is make sure you've got the load prescribed appropriately. And if it's eccentrics, it needs to be a percentage of an eccentric 1 rep max. And just to kind of, you know, maybe further support that, I don't know if y'all saw the Behringer study, but I like that paper because it's a knee extension exercise at a 75% of 1 rep max with and without BFR. And the BFR is like 20 millimeters of mercury below AOP. So it's a pretty high pressure, but you can see the control group could do like 142 repetitions at that load without BFR. You add BFR and now 85 reps was the max. So you still see an acceleration of fatigue, but it's not as quick as if you were doing an isotonic exercise, and this is a max, like a heavy load, like a 75% load, and they're still doing 85 reps at a 75% load with at least 80% pressure somewhere in there.
Mm-hmm.
So we see an acceleration.
Did they
fatigue.
measure? I think that's what I was talking about. They got there in a third of the time or whatever. But did they measure muscle damage or DOMs or anything?
Let me see. I forget. Yeah, they just looked at soreness, range of motion, that kind of thing. CK, and didn't see any differences between the groups.
No different.
Yeah. So despite the volume differences, even. So that was one of the thoughts on that paper was, well, maybe because the BFR group did less volume, they didn't see that. But the pseudo paper might suggest that, hey, there's actually a protective effect of the addition of BFR here. So
Yep. Yeah. So yet another case of BFR isn't magic and it doesn't fix exercise prescription.
It doesn't fix your crappy exercise prescription.
Yeah.
But if you prescribe it right, there could be a play with Eccentrics. And by the way, if any funding mechanisms are listening to this podcast, we still have that grant proposal.
We are happy to help.
Ready to go. Even though the Pac-12 isn't really a thing anymore. We'd have to get some more teams, but
it's really not. It's really not. I did want to just kind of highlight one other study, not because it's a great, it's a fine study. It's just not really going to support one way or another what we discussed, but important again, context. So I don't know if y'all saw Dr. Hill's paper, where they did a bicep curl, but then they measured the non-exercising side. So they did a concentric 1 rep max. I'm sorry, no, it was isokinetic, but eccentric versus concentric with BFR, and then look to see was there like a crossover effect, and they only saw the crossover effect happen in their eccentric group. I would say that the reason I say I wanted to discuss that was because that study shouldn't be used to support, hey, BFR creates a crossover effect, because like when you look at, let's just load this heavy for a crossover effect, you see a greater effect or at least the same magnitude of effect. So there's no reason to do BFR. Just load that heavy if you can to create that crossover effect.
And that was always Steve Patterson's point that he made on, cross transfer, crossover. It's like, we know a lot more about heavy load, so why not do the heavy versus trying to say BFR is the thing that's going to give it to you.
Stevie boy getting multiple shout-outs on this.
Hey.
That means
I learned things
the other day.
It's been a minute.
Guess we need to get them back on.
Yeah.
Well, and then I guess, lastly, another way to just think about your eccentrics was talking about another Euro friend, Alex's eccentric IPC paper. And so doing IPC prior to heavy eccentrics, significantly less muscle damage and soreness. So if you hate, and then maybe you should be IPCing before you do your once a year, to protect you for 9 months, apparently, eccentric work. But IPC prior, if your athletes hate it, there is at least a study from Alex that showed significantly took down the muscle damage.
And that just goes to show you that all of these things are so multifactorial, there's so many different theories as to why there's this protective effect. And then multiple reasons that we can either prove or disprove. And then you have something like that where it's like, well, that could have nothing to do with the lateral force transmission, the protective effect that IPC might provide. So there's clearly more going on than, just a simple.
And some of those, there was one, they used 40% LOP. And there's just such big variance sometimes. And when they're like, well, we didn't see a change, like, well, 40% might not be enough.
All right. Appreciate y'all humoring me.
I like this, man. I like this. I didn't have to prepare hardly at all.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to do it,
If anyone's going to be at NATA, Ben will be out there. This podcast might come out right before he goes. We have courses. all over the place.
Mhm.
Focus. BFR with throwing. It's blowing up. So people check out our website, get some courses, and like our freaking podcast, man. We haven't got any likes
Are
in a
you
long
listening?
time.
Is anybody actually listening?
Yes, still here? Yeah.
Are you still there?
Would help if we actually keep them coming out regularly, which we're working. We have a ton of badass guests coming up.
We do.
So
Yeah.
if you didn't
Working on that.
hear our last 2 podcasts, they're really good. The one with Dr. Feely, man, learned some cool little
Yeah.
shit last week, 2 weeks ago, whatever.
Good stuff.
All right.
Great
Cool.
guys.
Kyle,
Yeah.
Zach, see you later.
Wherever Zach is,
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
out
Have to
there. He just
add
had to get
Zach's
his eccentrics in.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for having me back on here, guys. It's
Yeah,
been a
man.
while.
Yeah, it's good to
We'll
have
have
you.
more. I got a lot
See y'all in about a year.
lot of topics. Yep. All right. Later, guys.
Later.
Thanks for tuning in to the Owens Recovery Science Podcast. Before we go, a quick reminder that the information discussed on this show is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Always consult with your healthcare provider before making any changes to your treatment or training regimen. For show notes and additional resources, be sure to check out owensrecoveryscience.com. And don't forget to like the show and subscribe for more evidence-based insights. Until next time, earn your deflate.